Welcome to Incentives Management Group. For 25 years, Incentives Management Group has been helping corporations to reduce cost and increase investment ROI by obtaining incentives from state, county, and local governments. To enhance our understanding of business segments that relate to ours, we started this experts interview series in the last year. In it, we talk with thought leaders in key service businesses. My guest today is Dave Naylor. Dave is Executive Vice President of a company called To Logical. They are a top 20 global leadership development company. He is an author, a Forbes contributor, a LinkedIn advisor, and much more. I met Dave 2 years ago when we did a webinar together. Let's meet Dave. So Dave, welcome to our interview series. I appreciate you sharing some time with us and your thoughts today.
You're very welcome, Marty.
Why don't you start off with giving us an overview on your career and what you're doing now?
Sure, Marty. You know, I've spent the better part of my career in the consulting and the learning and development space over the last probably 20 years, primarily in Fortune 1000 companies around the world. I think we do business in about 95 countries at this point in time. So basically what I do is I spend the bulk of my time going into organizations, diagnosing basically the people problems that they're facing, and then building out leadership solutions to address those, or helping organizations to build out leadership universities so they can create more continuity across their employee team, which obviously increases retention, succession planning, and helps them to be able to grow and scale.
What's the biggest challenge that that leadership faces when they're engaged with you and you're giving them some direction that would probably require them to alter their behavior?
Yeah. You know, so many organizations, they've got a depth in their management talent, and they understand the management side of the role, which is more the process side, the goals, the strategies, you know, that side of the business. But they really struggle on the people side, which is really the leadership side of things. And for many individuals, they've oftentimes never had the benefit of ever having a great leader by their side. So there aren't a lot of role models for people to emulate. And many organizations, they haven't built out an infrastructure to help people to kind of build a scalable, leadership talent within themselves as they transition through various roles. So it's really, I mean, if you look at really virtually every organizational challenge, if you distill it down to a root cause, it's a people problem. It's, how do we get our people to be more accountable? I just did a survey on LinkedIn, and in the survey, I asked folks that were kind of in my network, what are the bigger challenges for you right now? Accountability, adaptability, resilience, or innovation? And I kind of expected when I put the survey out that innovation would be the biggest challenge right now, just given, I really expected innovation or adaptability to be the biggest challenges that people would come back to, just given the COVID environment that we're in right now and virtualization of the workforce and all of that. But interestingly enough, an overwhelming percent of respondents came back and they said accountability was the biggest challenge that they're seeing in their organization, which is, people spend too much time making excuses and pointing fingers and rationalizing why a strategy can't be implemented or why it will work in this pocket of the organization, but not, the pocket that person's in. So it's very hard to build anything on a foundation of that victim thinking that many organizations face as they're trying to address those people problems. So I think that's probably the biggest thing.
Is that fundamentally self-doubt on the part of the leader and the people that are in the organization?
There's definitely a component of that. there's really, we spend a lot of our time focusing in the very emerging field of motivational intelligence. It's about 6 years that since we've had the kind of the most significant discovery about us as human beings. Researchers at Harvard discovered the mechanism by which our motivational intelligence works. I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we go on. But there's three components that support our motivational intelligence, which is really the driver of our success as human beings. The first is purpose. Purpose is the spark, if you will, that engages people. It sets a sense of direction for them. The second piece of that is the accountability, we call it ultimate responsibility side of things, because when an individual is rooted the right way in ultimate responsibility, they put themselves in a position of control. And when I say that, it's not control of everything that happens out here in the external environment. It's really control of the two things that really the only two things that you and I have complete control of in life, which is what we choose to think and what we choose to do. When an individual takes ownership of those things or accepts control of those things, there's really not a whole lot that'll stop them, because they'll just keep relentlessly moving forward until they figure things out. So, it's purpose, it's control. And then the third piece you talked about, Marty, which is that adaptability or that learning side of things. And when an individual, they have the right beliefs about their ability to learn, to adjust and adapt, what happens is they're not governed by those self-doubts. They're not looking at other people saying they can do it and I can't. But rather what they do is they look at life from a perspective of how can I be better tomorrow than I am today? And thus, as they move through each one of their days, they're focusing on practicing those most important things. They're more reflective. And so when you put those three pieces together, we hear a lot about growth mindsets nowadays. That's what really creates a growth mindset, which is the measure of a higher level of motivational intelligence.
So you've been in, we're switching a little bit here, taking a little bit broader perspective on the industry. You've been in learning and development for, as you say, 20 years. What are the major changes that you've seen, and what are some that you might be thinking about going forward?
Obviously the biggest change is just, current with the environment that we're in, which is the virtualization of our workforce. Outside of industries where that isn't possible, manufacturing, that side of things, a huge percentage of the knowledge workers have gone virtual at this stage of the game. And so organizations, even 2 years in, are still grappling with that, grappling with, are we going to bring people back into an office environment? Can we bring people back into an office environment? The initial feedback that we're seeing kind of across our client base is that people don't really want to come back into that traditional office environment. So if you ask me to guess, I'd say we'll have some kind of a hybrid model on the backside of all of this. And that creates a new avenue of virtual leadership, of how do you engage, how do you coach, how do you develop people when they're working from home versus a centralized office environment. So that's been a huge issue that has very much been a global one. We've seen that across our clients around the world. The other two, I think, are tied a bit to the environment that we're in, but are also generationally tied as well. What we're starting to see is the evolution of more micro learning and more just-in-time learning. Traditionally, we have kind of run L&D in corporate America like we run learning in colleges or in grade school. You bring people together in a centralized environment and you teach them a given subject or a given aptitude to be able to take a more effective action or a best practice. And I think that there's some inherent flaws with that strategy. The sustainment side has always been a bit of a challenge. And so what's happening now, and it's largely being driven by our late stage millennials, our Gen Zers, is that desire for just-in-time micro learning. We see it on YouTube. Likely, you've done this as well, Marty, where you've got a leaky faucet at home or something like that, and you go to YouTube and you're looking up for your brand of faucet and saying, how do I change that washer, or how do I swap out that cartridge? That's micro learning. It's just in time when you need it. And so we're going to see more and more of that moving forward for a few reasons. One, we've got the generation that's coming into the workforce and starting to more dominate it. They're demanding it.
Yeah.
Two, technology is supporting it better, so the delivery mechanisms are there more effectively than they've been in the past. And in a third component of that, and I think this is going to be a major trend moving forward, is organizations are now starting to look at developing people more holistically. So rather than just teaching salespeople to sell, for example, they're realizing that if we develop them more holistically, in other words, we develop both the mindset and the skill sets simultaneously, the things that have kept people from embracing the skill sets dissipate. And so they take greater ownership of those skills. They take greater ownership of practicing those things. They become more effective. As they become more effective, they become more engaged. As they become more engaged, they're more likely to stay with the organization. And, we've got clients now that are doing that. In fact, I was reading an email before we started here today. They've got a unicorn technology startup. And they, here we are in the midst of the Great Resignation. People are leaving in droves, particularly in the technology industry. And they've focused over the last year of developing their leadership team this way, of developing their frontline employees this way. And what they've been able to do is they've hired 600 people through the course of the Great Resignation and through the course of COVID. And they've got a 29% increase in their employee retention. So it pays dividends. It's documentable when you develop people more holistically, really focusing on that wellness side of things. So I think those are the three big trends. It's the virtual side of things. It's more micro learning, and it's developing people more holistically.
Yeah, on the virtual side, I was doing some research on a company that we're prospecting on, and I went to look at their career portion of their website to see what kind of people they were looking for and where their locations were and that kind of stuff and so forth. And half of the positions, that was my gut feel, I didn't do a scientific search, half of the positions were at-home positions.
Yeah. It makes a huge, I was speaking with one of our clients they're a major energy producer, and they've got offices around the world. So I was speaking with one of their executives who's over in Germany here not too long ago. And so he hires a lot of engineering talent. And, we were talking about, kind of the environment of what's going on. And he said, the challenge I always faced pre-COVID is I was trying to source engineering talent locally. And so I had a more limited pool of people to draw from. He said, the beauty of what's happened, in this virtual environment now is my pool has expanded exponentially. I can recruit people from anywhere in the world. And so I've been able to bring in a lot more talent and a lot more specialized talent than I was ever able to, in the past.
Tell me about Dave Naylor. Who's the professional?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that there's a huge difference, because I happen to have a career path where one sort of bleeds into the other. I feel incredibly blessed to get to do what I do, and I didn't aspire to do this. Candidly, when I was in college, I didn't even know that people did this for a living. But what's awesome about my role, or for anybody in my role, is that you get to make a difference in people's lives. You get to help people to kind of take the shackles off of what's held them back. And you're able to help them to begin to see themselves, to see their opportunities from an entirely different light. And it's incredibly rewarding to be able to do that for people, and to see it ripple, not just for them professionally, but in their personal lives as well. I shared a story here yesterday. I was speaking with in one of our open classes with a group of executives, and I shared with them a story about something that happened to me just kind of before, the world got turned upside down with COVID. And I was out in California. I was working with one of our clients there, and I was making my way back to Rochester, New York, where I live, and I'm in the airport in LAX. A guy comes up to me, and he kind of puts his hand out, and he said, you may not remember me. He goes, I was in one of your groups here a number of years ago. And I'm like, oh, no kidding. And we're just kind of getting ourselves caught up. And he looks at me, he goes, when we were all together, he goes, you were talking about, management, leadership, and people and business, and all this stuff. He said, but he goes, I got to tell you, he goes, my mind really wasn't so much on the class that week. And I, kind of gave him a confused look, and he said, yeah. He goes, at the time, he said, my wife and I, he said, we were fighting all of the time. And he said, it had gotten to the point where we literally were sitting down and we were figuring out who was going to get what in the divorce. And he said, I sat there that week, and as we were talking, he said, I couldn't help but realize how so much of what we were talking about applied to me just as much at home as a husband as it did at work as a people leader. And he said, and I realized that week that there was just a lot of things that I wasn't doing the right way. He said, we wrapped up the class, and he goes, I on my drive home, he said, I literally made a commitment to myself that before I threw in the towel on that relationship, that I was going to do it the right way. I was going to put into practice the things that we had talked about together. And he looks at me and goes, Dave, he goes, that was 5 years ago now. And he said, and not only am I still married today, he said, but today, he goes, I think I have one of the best marriages of anybody I know. He said, I know it wasn't really designed to do it. He said, but I wanted to let you know when I saw you here in the airport that class that week, he said, it saved my marriage. Mm. And, it's a pretty awesome experience to get to lay your head on a pillow at night and know that, that somehow your words and sharing your experience and just engaging people in a conversation can have that ripple effect.
Yeah. That's terrific. I know that there's another experience that you shared with me some information about recently that I'd love you to talk about, because I think everybody out there would benefit by listening to you talk about COVID.
Yeah. I was I was one of the unfortunate people who drew the short straw on COVID. Despite doing my best to protect myself and to stay safe. I ended up contracting it in the early part of November. And, at first, you hear so many stories, about people's experiences and things like that. And, so there's that initial wave of the unknown where you're just kind of scared. But then then you kind of think it through logically, and I don't have any morbidities. I'm healthy. I'm in shape. Seemingly, I'm not in the age bracket where there's higher risk factors. I'm approaching it, but I'm not there yet. So I thought I'd be fine, and initially it started out like a cold, and then I got fever, and about 4 days in, it got tougher to breathe. And I was about a week in, and my wife, who's a registered nurse, it was a Sunday morning, And she comes into the bedroom and she said, she goes, I'm thinking maybe we should take you to urgent care today, just to have them look at you, and so I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. And next thing I know, she's like helping me to get dressed, which she never does. And she's like kind of hustling me out the door and, gets me into the car. We get to urgent care at 8:59. They open at 9. And she walks me to the door and she said, they won't let me come in. She said, but she was just tell them that you have COVID and you're having trouble breathing. I go, okay. Lady comes, she unlocks the door. I walk in, she asked me, I say that to her. There's a doctor who's standing there. And he says, he goes, well, follow me back, into one of the exam rooms. So I go back with him and he listens to my lungs. He puts an oxygen sensor on my finger. He says, I'll be right back. And he comes back into the room wheeling an oxygen tank and puts the oxygen on me. And he says, you're suffering from acute respiratory failure. He goes, we need to get you to the hospital immediately because you're dying. He goes, right now, he goes, your lungs are functioning at such a low level that they're starving your cells, your organs, and your brain of oxygen. And thus they're beginning to die. So we need to get you to the hospital right now. 4 minutes later, I'm in the back of an ambulance being rushed to the hospital. I've never really been sick in that sense. I've never spent time in a hospital. It was a very confusing and overwhelming experience, I will say. While I was there, they were throwing everything they could think of to kind of help my lungs to start working better again. And I'd been there for 4 days, and the doctor comes in and he asked me, he goes, I don't see it in your chart. He said, but do you have COPD? And I'm like, no. He goes, are you a smoker? I said, no. He goes, have you ever been? I said, no. He said, have you ever had any lung injuries, anything that's damaged your lungs? And I said, no. I said, not that I'm aware of. And I said, why are you asking me these questions? And he said, because I've done everything I can to get your lungs working better, and they're not working better. And he goes, I'm really at a crossroads in terms of deciding what is the next step. He said, we're giving you as much oxygen as we can give you right now through the means that we're using, and your body's still not accepting it. And I didn't know in that moment, like what he really meant as he was explaining that. I came to understand it later on when I was talking to my wife, who was a nurse, who, as I mentioned, was interacting with the doctors on the backside the whole time. But basically, he was deciding, do they take me out of the COVID floor that I'm on and take me to intensive care and put me on a ventilator? That even though I didn't really understand what he meant, I knew it wasn't good where I was. And I did some talking to God that day, and it was interesting as the day progressed. It was almost as though I could feel a lot of people out there praying for me, supporting me, sending me their best wishes. It was I didn't realize, because I would, all I knew was this, 4 by 9 foot bed I was in. I didn't realize the number of people outside of that hospital who knew what was going on with me, and were sending me their best wishes. At the end of the day, that doctor came back to my room, and he said to me, he goes, I don't know what happened today. He goes, but something happened.
Yeah.
He said, because your lungs are working better than they were this morning. And So 3 days after that, I was being wheeled out of the hospital and um, heading back home and starting a recovery process that was much longer and more difficult than I ever expected it to be. Um, the most amazing thing between you and me, Marty, though, the physical rehabilitation side was difficult. The mental side of it was really the most amazing part of it for me, because as I was going through and you come out of the hospital and you're in kind of a fog, they call it, and you think you're coherent, but people you're speaking to say that you're basically talking gibberish. Um, but as that began to clear, the only way I can really describe it is it was almost as though my brain rebooted itself. Just like we reboot our laptops, it was like that happened for my brain. And just like on our laptops, our internet browsers, the caches clog up with, all the crap from the websites that we've been through and all of that kind of stuff. And you reboot it and it cleans everything out and it just runs more efficiently. And that's exactly what happened to my brain. And it was an amazing experience that I went through. I realize now there was kind of 4 phases of that rebooting process. But from a mental perspective, it was the most incredible experience I've ever gone through. And it showed me a perspective that candidly I didn't know existed before. Literally to the extent where probably 3 weeks out of the hospital, I was sitting up in bed. I didn't sleep a lot when I came home from the hospital, and it's probably 4 a.m. in the morning, and I was sitting in bed and I was crying, and I was thanking God for giving me COVID so that I could experience what I had experienced here.
Yeah, that's exactly what you said to me when we were talking about doing this interview. And I was just, shocked at that point in time. But it now makes a lot more sense. We didn't have a chance to talk a lot when we were talking way back then, but it makes a lot more sense now. I mean, it sounds like, it sounds like don't sweat the small stuff was was the outcome of your brain rebooting itself, and understanding perspective.
It was, there definitely is a values component that, that came from it. And there was a lot of other components too. But yeah, it was very, very profound, and it ripples in me to this day, which is pretty incredible.
Well, let's move off of what is a very emotional and obviously a somewhat life-changing experience for you, and talk about To Logical. What is the focus of To Logical? What's its geographic reach? What are some of the principles that it operates on, and so forth?
So, To Logical is a little more than 30 years old at this point in time. We started out as a regional training and development firm, largely focused in the sales side of things back 30 years ago. And today we've grown and morphed. As I mentioned, we work in 95, I think, countries, maybe even slightly more than that. We have offices, not only here in the States, but in Europe, in the Middle East, and Asia Pacific, that support clients in those regions. We work pretty much across every vertical. I don't know that there's a single vertical that we don't work in at this stage of the game. And largely the reason for that is because, as I mentioned earlier, every organization has people problems. And that's really where our area of expertise is, in helping them to solve those people problems. And to no small extent, our big differential advantage, going back into the 90s, we really began to focus on designing training solutions that developed people at a mindset level and a skill set level. The reason, if you look at, well, virtually every training and development organization, their expertise is in the skill set side of things. How do we teach people to take the better actions? How do we teach them to implement a new strategy? How do we get them to embrace different best practices? And all of those training and development issues, organizations, they have the same fundamental challenge. It's buy-in. It's how do we drive adoption? They'll get 5, 6, 7% of adoption rate on what it is they're teaching people. And then the other 93% of people will maybe take an idea or two or do nothing with it. And so going back in the 90s, we recognized the influence of mindset in driving adoption on skill set. So we began to develop training systems on that focused on both of those. What's been interesting is what's happened from a research perspective over really the course of the last 20 years. And, we really began in the middle 90s to learn about the influence of emotional intelligence. We always, well, for, probably 120 years now, we've known about the influence of IQ on success, which is actually a very small component. Interesting. In the mid 90s, Daniel Goleman taught us about emotional intelligence and the influence that has on communication and leadership and empathy and those types of things. In 2016, researchers at Harvard doing what are called flipping on my name, magnetic MRI, electromagnetic scans on the brain. And they discovered a pretty phenomenal aspect of our brain, because what they discovered is that you and I, all of us as human beings, we have a packet of neuron synapses that connect our right and left hemisphere back to the oldest and most evolved part of the brain. And with that, they really discovered two things. They discovered the root of our consciousness, and they also discovered the mechanism by which our motivational intelligence, or MQ, works. So what we know now about ourselves as human beings is that we don't have one type of intelligence. We don't have two, we actually have three. We have our motivational intelligence, our emotional intelligence, and our IQ. Each serves a different function. What further research has done, they did some really wonderful studies out of Oxford, evolutionary biologists, and how the brain evolved. And in that, what they've helped us to understand is how in a different phase of the evolutionary cycle, we developed as a survival mechanism each of these different forms of intelligence. And even though they were developed within us going back to 500 million years ago, they still work in us exactly the same way they did in our ancestors. And so our MQ is really our success intelligence. It's what rules our fight or flight mechanism. It's what defines whether somebody will hang in and persist in the face of adversity or throw up their hands and give up, whether they'll adopt a positive attitude or a negative attitude about things, whether they will, desperately cling to the status quo, or whether they'll be open-minded to change and innovation. So of the three forms of intelligence, the one that has the greatest influence on us as individuals and us in terms of organizational leaders is decidedly MQ. Mm-hmm. And so we've been very blessed to be on the forefront of this, develop the world's first training systems that were built around it. We've implemented it around the world. And candidly, today, it's one of the reasons why we have been consistently listed as one of the top 20 leadership development organizations in the world because of that specialized knowledge.
That's exciting. It's interesting to see the depth of the foundation for what you do. Moving on to another subject. So there's a lot of uncertainty today, obviously. it's almost funny to make that statement, but it's crazy the amount of uncertainty. Do you see what adjustments do you see the companies and the leadership of companies are making to address that based upon your insight into those companies?
Obviously the biggest concern is how do we keep our employees, how do we keep them safe? How do we keep them healthy? There's the humanistic side of that. And there's also a legal side of that, where organizations, there's a lot of uncertainty. If we bring people back into an office environment and they end up getting sick with COVID, do we open ourselves up to liability issues? So, so there's really two sides of that coin. So organizations have been very much forced to innovate. And, how do we maintain business continuity in this uncertain environment? It's interesting. I think if you would have asked most senior level executives in February of 2020, if they, how long they thought it would take to virtualize their workforce, most likely the answer would have been years to get the technology and really figure out how to make it work. And yet most organizations were able to do it in 60 to 90 days. So it proves that we can rapidly innovate when there's a clear enough purpose behind it. And so I think it'll be the most fundamental change that certainly you and I will see in our lifetime, as it relates to the business world. And that innovation's, it's driving change obviously from a technical standpoint, but it's also improving quality of life for a lot of employees.
So if you were talking to a young person today, what would be the advice that you would give them coming into the business world? You've got a significant amount of experience, and you have some life-changing experience recently. So add that all together, and you're talking to a college audience, and the question is asked, what's the best advice you can give us?
It's that's I actually do that more than you would think. That's I have a lot of parents who will ask me to speak to their children as they're coming out of college. I actually sit on the board of directors for a university, and we'll come in and speak to their graduating classes and things like that fairly frequently. So that's a pretty common question.
It's a softball question for you.
Yeah, exactly. The biggest thing, that they have to be able to do is they have to be able to differentiate themselves as they're coming out into the work world. And, what I'll advise them on doing is first building their story that they tell when they go into an interview. So it's not just about answering questions, but it's being able to weave the questions that are asked around their story. And what I'll explain to them is that if you can focus your story on 5 key areas, you will differentiate yourself from anybody else that's going through that interviewing process. So look for examples that support these 5 areas in your story. So those 5 areas are a willingness to be accountable, the ability to be adaptable, having the ability to be mentally resilient or to bounce back from adversity, being willing to take the initiative, and having the ability to move with courage in times of uncertainty. And, if a candidate can come into an interview and share with whoever they're speaking with, examples of, here's something I learned, and here was the lesson I carried from it, and this is how I've woven it into the fiber or the fabric of who I am. And they can reinforce those 5 things. In every instance that, that I've watched young people do that, they end up getting hired. So that's the biggest thing, is just understanding, how do you differentiate yourself? And then how do you really become in those 5 areas? Because not only will it differentiate you in an interview, but it'll differentiate you from everybody else that, is looking to be promoted and looking to grow within that organization.
Yeah. It also, obviously, beyond the getting a job, it gives them a framework within which to be thinking about themselves and moving forward in their career and in life.
And in personal lives too. It's very holistic from that perspective. You're right.
What we're so task focused, and today's urgencies are upon us all the time and so forth. What do you do to stay up to date, and how do you carve out the time to do that?
The biggest thing that I do is, we all have downtime, where, maybe our hands are busy, but our mind is not. And so the biggest thing that I will try to do to stay up to date and stay current with what's going on, I listen to a lot of podcasts. On my way into the studio this morning, I was listening to a podcast, a Tim Ferriss podcast, where he had a physicist on who was talking about the nature of string theory and quantum physics. And it's an area where definitely was not my strong suit in school. But by the same token, we begin to realize how much it really influences every aspect of our universe. And so, I'll use those times when I'm working out or when I'm in the car to listen to podcasts from a very diverse range of backgrounds. So I'll listen to, obviously business leaders, and to learn about their experiences. I'll listen to scientists. I'll listen to people in the medical community, because you just never know where you're going to pick up that next nugget from. I do the same thing. If at nighttime, if I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't sleep, I'll go on YouTube and I'll watch, BBC has this wonderful series called BBC Reel. And they're just little short 7-8 minute videos on different topics. I watched one on not long ago about how scientists in Israel had figured out a way to basically bring back an extinct fig tree that died off about 2,500 years ago. And they found some old seeds in a cave, and they figured out how to bring these seeds back to life. And they're growing an orchard of these fig trees that had become extinct. And, there was another one I watched. They discovered this, basically an early computer from 2,500 years ago that was done in ancient Greece. It was a series of gears that they had a level of, like, literally down to a millimeter level precision in these gears. And this mechanism could calculate the position of the stars, just by moving dials around, and it could go forward or backwards to be able to calculate all of that. And they said it was literally thousands of years more advanced than what they expected back from those times. But sadly, that technology got lost with the fall of the Bronze Age. So what I try to do is I try to use my time. This was an outgrowth actually of COVID, what I realized, that the best way to use our time is to really focus our time on one of two things: either something that makes us better as a human being, or something that makes somebody else better as a human being. And, pre-COVID, I wasted a lot of time on nonsense things. I don't do that so much anymore.
The last area that I wanted to explore with you, we all, as I said just a minute ago, we all focus our time on getting stuff done and so forth. You've explained how you enhance your own knowledge and experience by using YouTube and other media when you have small amounts of downtime. The subject I want to ask about now, though, is how does To Logical work on its business, not simply in the business getting work done, but how does it evolve, and is there is there either a culture or a process that you have, or some other secret sauce that allows you to evolve and grow as a company?
That's a hugely important question, Marty. So many individuals, so many organizations, they are just so myopically focused on working in the business and fighting the fires and reacting to the challenges of the day. And because of that, they lose sight of the broader lessons that are there, and they lose sight of opportunities, where they could grow and they could expand. Years ago, it probably goes back 25, maybe more years. I was coaching a lady who was one of the top realtors in the city I live in. And we were trying to set up our next coaching meeting. And I said, what about, this Friday, And she goes, oh, I can't do it then. She goes, that's my disappear day. And I remember I'm like, your disappear day? What is that? She goes, one day a month. She said, what I do is, she goes, I block my calendar. I don't have any meetings, nothing going on. She said, I go to the library. And she goes, because nobody thinks to look for me in the library. And she said, and that's my day where I just focus on me and my business. And I take the time to step back and ask myself, what's working, what's not working, what adjustments do I need to make? She goes, I look at every pocket of my life, my relationships, my physical health, my finances. And then she goes, I'll look at my business and I'll go through that process. She goes, and then I build out my plan for the next 30 days. And that idea of taking a disappear day, I'd never heard of before, but I realized as she was explaining it, that it was genius, because you have to be able to pull yourself out of that fire to get the right perspective. I remember not long after that, I was reading one of Bill Gates' books, and he talked about the fact that he does a disappear week a month. And, it just reinforced that concept. Now, I can't, maybe having $100 billion gives you the ability to disappear for a week, or maybe disappearing for a week gets you to 100 billion. I'm not sure which way that worked, but the principle was the same. And, I think so often people look at working, they try to work on their business and, we're going to set aside this hour meeting or something like that. And you just can't do it. It just doesn't work, because you're still too caught up in the whirlwind of what's going on in the business. You've got to get yourself out of the office into a neutral environment, do that reflection, and then build your plan moving forward. I think that's absolutely the key. And I think that gets missed a lot.
Yeah. Dave, this has been an exciting and very worthwhile, content-rich time period with you, and I really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and your time with us, and look forward to us doing it again in a couple of years and getting a new perspective from you.
There you go. Well, hopefully it'll be valuable to your audience, and they'll find a golden nugget in there that means something to them. And by all means, if anybody who listens to this would like to reach out to me, connect to me on LinkedIn or anything along those lines, I'm happy to help. One of the great benefits of getting to do what I get to do is I get to meet a lot of cool and interesting people. So if anybody would like to connect to me and learn a little bit more about anything that we've chatted about, I'm happy to help. And Marty, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks again, Dave.
All right.